Welcome to the Amazing Grace Bible class. Hi, I'm Steve Flatt, and I'm the teacher of the class, and I'm thrilled that you've joined us today. We're in a series right now that's called And He Talks With Me, and we're looking at the life of Jesus, but more specifically at teachings from His life that really impact our lives and tell us the way we're supposed to live. In just a few minutes, we're going to look at another one of those teachings, and I believe your life will be blessed by it. So go get a Bible if you don't have one on your lap right now, and be ready to turn to John 13 in just a moment. But before we have our lesson, let's enjoy a great time of singing, and Nick Boone's going to lead us as we do sing together.
Today's question to be answered during the lesson is, in John 13, Jesus served because he knew, A, who he was, B, what he could do, or C, where he was going. Stay tuned for the answer following the lesson. John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and to go to his Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God, and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that he poured water into a basin, and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "A person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not every one was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them."
We're in our series, "And He Talks with Me." And today I want us to look at a lesson, a teaching from Jesus, where what He does speaks more loudly than what He says. It's in John chapter 13, and the lesson deals with servanthood. Let's get an idea of what the scene is. The scene is an upper room in Jerusalem. It is the last week of Jesus' life. In fact, it's the last night of His life prior to His crucifixion. Now, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record the scene in the upper room, but the focus of Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel accounts deals with the institution of the Lord's Supper, that wonderful, precious memorial feast that we observe every week as God has commanded us, so that we'll think back to that cross and that sacrifice. But John emphasized what happened just before the supper. In fact, he emphasizes what happened when they walked into the room. And Jesus taught this magnificent lesson on servanthood. It was read to us just a few moments ago. And in our short lesson time today, I want us to concentrate on 4 or 5 characteristics of a Christ-like servant from John 13. Here's the first characteristic of a Christ-like servant. Actions are motivated by love. A Christ-like servant isn't motivated by fear. A Christ-like servant isn't motivated by intimidation or guilt, but we're motivated because we just want to serve. In John 13, verses 1 and 2, we see that Jesus' actions are motivated by His love. Read those again with me. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for Him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved His own who were in the world, He now showed them the full extent of His love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. I could preach to you an hour just on those 2 verses, because there's so much said about the love of Jesus. And here would be my 4-point sermon about His love. Number 1, we can see in those 2 verses now that His love was possessive. Do you see where it says, Jesus loved His own? You see, they were family to Him. Reminds me of what my mother said when I was about to get married, and went on with that. And she said, "Honey, I'm giving you away, but I want you to know something. You're still going to always be my own." There's a possessiveness about a deep love. Second thing about His love, it's continuous. Most translations render the end of verse 1 is, He loved them to the end. He never stopped, right up to His death. Third characteristic of His love was the fact that it was unconditional. He knew Judas was about to betray Him, and yet one of the most surprising things about this foot-washing scene is that He washes Judas's feet too. And He didn't do it with a sneer. And He didn't do it with hatred in His heart, but loving Judas just like He loved Peter, James, John, and the rest. Oh, and the fourth thing about His love, it was absolutely unselfish. This is the hour of our Lord's greatest need. He's about to go to the cross. He knows it. Knows how it's going to be, knows about the pain. He knows who's going to betray Him. If there was ever a time that Jesus needed ministering to, it was right now. But instead, what does He do? He ministers to them. That's that unselfish love. Somebody says, how could Jesus do this kind of thing? Here's how. His love motivated his actions. The first characteristic of a Christ-like servant is it's all based on love. Here's characteristic number 2. A Christ-like servant has a security that frees us to minister to others effectively. Now listen to that again. This may be the best point of the whole sermon, all right? A Christ-like servant has a security that frees us to minister to other people. I think verses 3 through 5 are the high water mark of this passage. Let's look at them again. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Do you see that? You see? Look at verse 3. I mark up my Bible. I underline things, and verse 3 is just marked all to pieces. You know why? Do you see that Jesus had the security of knowing who he was? And that gave him the freedom to serve. First 2 words of verse 3. Jesus knew. Circle that word, knew. Jesus knew. What did he know? He knew 3 great things. Number 1, he knew what he could do. He knew it says that the Father had put all things under his power. He knew what he could do. Number 2, he knew who he was. Look at the next phrase. And that he had come from God. Jesus knew who he was. And number 3, he knew where he was going. The last part of verse 3 says, and knowing that he was returning to God. I want to tell you something now. Think about this. If you know who you are, and if you know what you can do, and if you know where you're going, that will give you a great sense of security. See, that's the foundation of it all. And hear me now. The best servants are the most secure people. That's the key. You know, a sense of security does a lot of things for you. The secure person, for example, will take a risk. The secure person will reach up and dare to do something because they're not afraid of falling if they miss. That's one of the things security will do for you. That's a characteristic of a secure individual. But in this passage, I find another sign of security. Not only will the secure person reach up and stretch, the secure person will bend down and stoop. See? Because the secure individual isn't afraid to leave his or her position and to bow down to someone who is, quote, beneath, end quote, them. Look at verse 3. Jesus knew who he was, and he knew where he was going. Verse 4. So he takes a towel, ties it around his waist, bends over and washes dirty feet, and dries them off. I want to tell you something. Only the person who is extremely secure will leave his position and bend over. I want to make sure you see what's happening in this, okay? All Palestinian homes in the days of Jesus, they had basins of water right there at the doorway. Why? Because everybody walked wherever they went, and all the roads were dirty and dusty. So when somebody came in, they just cleaned their feet. Now, if it was a wealthy home, there was a servant there who would do that. In this upper room that the disciples were borrowing the night that Jesus would end up being arrested, there was no servant, and the disciples didn't want to wash each other's feet. And I'll tell you something else. They didn't even want to wash their own feet. You say, well, Steve, how do you know they didn't want to wash their own feet? I know they didn't because of what I read about this same scene in Luke 22. Luke 22 says when they entered the upper room, they immediately began to be arguing over who was greatest. And I want to guess here that argument took place right there around the water basin as they came in the door. See, they had been gaining more and more respect by a following now, and here they are walking in. They argue who's the greatest, and I can just see Peter, James, and John, that inner circle that kept getting closer to Jesus, saying, it's not our job. Somebody needs to wash our feet. Jesus obviously likes us more. And then some of the others saying, well, who are you to say that? And so they began to argue. You know what they were doing? They were playing the position game and they were all worrying about where they were on the organizational chart. And you know what's going to blow them away in a moment? What's going to blow them away is that the guy on top of the chart, the CEO, the big kahuna, he's going to bend down and do the work that the copy boy ought to be doing. I want to say one more thing about insecurity. The lesson's not on security, but it's on servanthood, but this is so pivotal. A person's insecurity may be their greatest enemy in life. You show me an insecure person, and I'll show you a life that's bombarded by problems. And most of their problems come from their own insecurity. You know, most of us have gone through stages of insecurity. Adolescents tend to have it worse than some of the rest of us, but they are by no means isolated. Now, I can remember as a boy going out to eat dinner with my family, you know, wondering how I looked and wondering who was with me and who would see me, and not wanting to be seen under the wing of my parents, and my dad just be sitting over there eating his chicken just to, you know, didn't bother him. You know, he'd see one of my friends and say, hey, oh, shh, don't say anything. You know, I was insecure. My dad was totally secure, you see. I'll tell you something. Only when you get to be secure do you have the freedom to serve. Jesus, he could wash feet. That was no big deal to him. He didn't care what anybody thought about him. Was it cool? Was it not cool? He didn't care. He's secure. I believe servanthood begins with security. I believe the only people who can truly and effectively serve other people are people who are secure themselves. The secure are free to serve. The insecure are shackled by their quest for security. Secure people are into towels, and insecure people are into titles. Secure people are into people, helping people. And insecure people are into positioning. That's what they're worried about. Jesus really blew them out of the water by showing them that the person who is the highest would pick up the wash basin and serve somebody else. Let's move on. Third characteristic from this passage. Third observation about servanthood is it exposes pride in the lives of others. It will. Look at verse 6 with me, okay? Jesus came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Now Peter's got a problem here, and it comes to the surface. It's interesting to me that in the original language, the two personal pronouns here are placed right beside each other, and that means that Peter was using greater emphasis. If you want to translate it most accurately, Peter would be saying, do you my feet wash? You my feet? See, Peter had the mindset of the hierarchy. He's wondering, who's on top? Where am I in the pecking order? How many are above me and how many are below me, and what do I need to do and what do I need to not do? Here's the problem. Peter didn't think Jesus should be serving him. But because he was position conscious, Peter didn't think he ought to be serving anybody else either. See, he was into the pecking order. And Peter was offended, verse 6, not because he was being served, he was offended because of who was serving him, because it messed up the system. And it made Peter worry that if the guy on top were serving him, maybe he needed to be serving somebody else. And that bothered him. In verse 7, Jesus said to him, Peter, you do not realize now what I am doing, but later you'll understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Peter's so sure he's right. You ever notice that? He's always so sure he's right that he's blind to his pride, he's blind to his ignorance. Bless his heart, Peter really did love Jesus. He just sometimes got his mouth ahead of his brain. And Jesus looked back at him, verse 8, and said, well, Jesus answered, Lord, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. See, God sends no one away empty except those who are full of themselves. And when Jesus says that, Peter, in his typical style, he jumped off at the mouth again. Verse 9, well then, Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. He said, just wash all of me. And Jesus said, no, that's not the point. By the way, don't be too hard on Peter. I think Peter was just the mouthpiece. I suspect all the disciples were thinking the same thing, watching Jesus with that basin, looking, what in the world is he doing? And one by one, as their own feet were being washed, being embarrassed at the lesson that was so obviously being taught. I'll tell you something, pride will make you do some awfully foolish things. I want you to get the picture of this supper. Da Vinci didn't have it quite right. For one thing, they didn't all sit on one side of the table. That just makes for a nice picture. At this supper, they probably weren't sitting at all. When they came in, the tables were low, and they would recline on these low-like sofas, and they would prop themselves up on one arm and eat with another. And what you've got to see now, if you're in a circle around this with everybody propped up, lying down, is that your head was right beside somebody's feet. You see? And pride was causing these disciples to not serve, but to keep their faces right beside somebody's smelly, stinky, dirty feet. You see what pride will do? I'll tell you what. Servanthood exposes that kind of pride. Oh, our time is up. Let me show you a couple of more real quickly. Fourth characteristic, servanthood teaches by example. Verses 12 through 15, it was read to you a moment ago. Jesus doesn't say a lot. He just washes their feet and said, now, I've given you an example. You do like I've done. Jesus is doing a thing we call modeling. I saw a bumper sticker the other day that made me snicker. It says, no matter what you teach your child, he insists on behaving like his parents. That's disgusting, isn't it? You try and tell them the right thing, and lo and behold, they just go act like you do. That's right, though, isn't it? You know, this wouldn't have worked if Jesus had said, now, Peter, James, John, you fellas, you ought to wash each other's feet. Come on, Peter, you go do it. Peter would have washed the feet, but he wouldn't have learned the lesson. You see why? Because it would have still been a hierarchy thing. Peter would have washed the feet because the boss was telling him to. And the lesson would have been lost. Had to be modeled. Servanthood always teaches by example. And then finally, true servanthood always lifts up Jesus. It really does. Let's drop down to verse 20 as we close. Verse 20 says, Jesus says, I tell you the truth, whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me. I draw two conclusions, not just from that verse, but from this whole passage. In allowing others, number one, in allowing others to serve me, I see Jesus. How true that is. When somebody serves me, I see the heart, the love, the spirit. I see Jesus in what they are doing. And the second conclusion is, in serving others, I show Jesus to them. Now, the question of the hour is, are you? Are you showing Jesus by how you serve? Let's bow and pray together. God, thank you for this magnificent teaching we've seen from John 13. Thank you for the way Jesus showed it, not just spoke it. And Father, from his example, may we be motivated by love. May we have the security of being in Christ and knowing who we are, and knowing where we've come from and knowing where we're going. May we have the security then to genuinely serve and not be caught up in positioning and hierarchy. May our pride be crumbled. And Father, may we model it to everyone so that folks can see Jesus in us. That is indeed our prayer in the name of Christ. Amen.
Today's question was, in John 13, Jesus served because he knew A, who he was, B, what he could do, or C, where he was going. The correct answer is A, B, and C.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that